Kia ora tātou. It's lovely to be here, slightly intimidating, but also lovely to be able to work through some of this material that, honestly, I've been thinking about, amongst other things, over the last 10 years or so. And part of what I want to do is draw together some threads from that work. Now, in the first half of the 19th century, British Protestant missionaries to New Zealand often framed their mission in irenic terms. That is, they imagined themselves and their message as peace bringers and peacemakers. As emissaries of the Prince of Peace, they spoke of bringing a gospel of peace. And this gospel promised the spiritual assurance of peace with God, as well as the social tranquility that would work for people's collective material advancement. Whatever else Christianity was, it was never less than that. Now, peace is a beautiful thing. It's also a complex and slippery term, and there's a lot to tease out about missionaries' understandings of peace, how they sought to enact it, the shape of their commitment to peace, and the influence of their peace gospel. And we've had some discussion around that already, even today. And there's a lot more there than can be teased out here, so the focus of this paper is quite modest. I want to address some of these questions of peace with an eye to our kaupapa on Christianity and colonialism. And my aim is to explore challenges to and of Christian peace with particular respect to the Wesleyan mission, especially on the west coast of the North Island. Nothing for the Anglicans to worry about here. The Wesleyan mission was very much the smaller, younger sibling of the CMS, yet it was nevertheless influential and for a time very strongly associated with the missionary peace gospel. Commitments were tested in the 1850s and 60s, however, and these seemed to result in a significant change of emphasis in WMS missionaries' articulations of Christian peace. So the issues there at stake concerned land and authority, which are of course central to more recent broad-ranging critiques of Christianity and related suspicions about missionary peace. So my suggestion here is that the shifts and the continuities in the Wesleyan's peace gospel are productive for thinking through issues of Christianity's relationship to colonialism in Aotearoa. So to step back a little, it's worth noting that peace is not usually identified as a central feature of the Protestant missionary movement. Indeed, in most scholarship, it's more common now to associate mission and Christianity broadly with the violence of colonial expropriation and oppression. This interpretation has been highly influential. Eru Hiko Tahuri, for example, recently relayed how encountering Māori at university who held radical views about colonisation proved pivotal in his own deconversion from Christianity and embrace of atheism. For this group, he says, one of the main instruments of colonisation in New Zealand was the church. For them, Christianity was a tool of the English colonial oppressor used to strip Māori of their land and sovereignty. Now, Eru's story is not so unusual. Similar stories can be told by a growing number of Māori atheists, along with a great many others, as we've already heard. While peace was never the dominant theme in modern Protestant missions, it was remarkably pervasive. And I think a good case can be made that it provided one of the key symbolic frames for the 19th century missionary project as it arose in the late 18th century. Peace symbols proliferated, with peace hailed as a central gift of Christianity. It was commended variously as a justification, means, and end of Christian missionary work. So we find this emphasis elaborated in a range of ways in the New Zealand missions, but also much further afield. So notable leaders in the fledgling LMS emphasised the centrality of peace as the very nature and design of the gospel, and the gospel's power to bring peace to the world. The LMS's emblem was in fact a dove with an olive branch in its mouth, and this was widely reproduced on coins and especially on flags. It was hoisted as the colour on John Williams' famous vessel called the Messenger of Peace, which he used in his Pacific voyages. In New Zealand and elsewhere, white flags were raised as emblems of peace to advertise the Sabbath itself, held up as a symbol of peace and rest. And peace was widely preached. When commissioned, missionaries were commonly urged to live at peace with each other and among the heathen, and to resist coercive means. So in that way, peace was articulated not just as a gift of the gospel, but also as a moral imperative, something that must be enacted. A truly diverse range of practices were conceptualised in relation to this imperative as part of the practice of peace. But for now, the key point is really that peace language, peace symbols had currency in the Protestant missionary world. So for the New Zealand Wesleyan John Whiteley, mission could be affirmed precisely because it was so intimately connected with the peace and happiness of the world, with its progress in all that is great and good. So as this suggests, references to peace covered a wide semantic range. Even the term gospel of peace had various meanings. Most often it was used in reference to promises of spiritual peace, but it was also used to commend social harmony, and specifically to condemn violence and repudiate retaliation. So within the context of empire, I suggest that these ubiquitous references in the Wesleyan mission and elsewhere can fruitfully be analysed in relation to a typology of three types of peace. And I've characterised these elsewhere as imperial peace, subversive peace, and proselytising peace. So briefly, imperial peace closely aligned the peace of Christianity with extension of the British Empire. It tied the advance of the Christian gospel to the growing reach of empire and European civilization, with both understood as mediators of peace. By contrast, subversive peace entailed a willingness to challenge empire in Christian terms, remonstrating over its wrongdoings and violence. Proselytizing peace was also a voice of critique, but focused squarely on indigenous ideas and customs that were identified as problems or sins for which the gospel provided solutions. Such sins often included endemic conflict and violence. Now, this approach could overstate the extent of violence among non-Christian peoples and mistake its functions. It also tended to minimise or rationalise violence within Christian worlds. And it often understated existing peacemaking commitments and expertise. Nevertheless, proselytising peace articulated as gospel need and the promised fruit of conversion, became deeply woven into missionary preaching. So to the Wesleyans. As I mentioned earlier, the Wesleyan mission started a little later than that of the CMS. It formally commenced in 1822 with the arrival of Samuel Lee. He spent 16 months living with William and Dinah Hall of the CMS here in the Bay of Islands before relocating to Kaiō with William White to establish the first WMS mission or station. The mission began to move out of Northland in the following decade with the significant turning to Christianity of the 1830s. So by 1848, the WMS reported that it had 12 principal stations in the North Island and 2 in the south, served by 18 ordained European missionaries and some 630 Christian Māori working, as they said, gratuitously as teachers in the mission schools or in conducting occasional religious services among their countrymen. John Whiteley was among the 18 and one of the early southward pioneers. He had arrived in New Zealand in 1833, staying briefly in Kaipara before establishing a new station in Kāwhia in 1834, and he stayed there for 23 years before relocating to Taranaki in 1856. Like other WMS missionaries, Whiteley clearly regarded himself as an agent of the gospel of peace. That phrase was a staple of proselytizing peace, most often used in relation to promises of spiritual peace, but also buttressed the critique of utu in terms of violent retribution and taua muru, and in the promotion of reconciliatory ethics. Whiteley's arrival at Kāwhia came at a time when such questions were particularly salient. A decade after Te Rauparaha and Ngāti Toa had been expelled, and during a period of raids by Waikato tribes down into Taranaki. And so in this context, he gained something of a reputation for peacemaking through efforts to dissuade taua, which periodically assembled at Kāwhia, from carrying out their intended actions. Anaru Eketone relays a tradition that the Wesleyan convert, Wiremu Pāteni's first encounter with mission Christianity, was observing John Whiteley during his Kāwhia ministry, standing between warring parties advocating for peace. Tāmati Kawiora, who became a Wesleyan teacher, similarly claimed to have seen Whiteley and John Waterhouse successfully urge a party to discontinue the work of evil, turn to religion that you may live. He also saw similar interventions have no impact whatsoever. Up to the 1850s, we have numerous accounts of Wesleyan missionaries teaching against retaliation, urging restraint, seeking to act as peace brokers. These included convert missionaries such as the influential Ngāti Mahanga leader Te Waitangi, baptised as Wiremu Nera, who was a key pioneer evangelist in Taranaki. Pāteni too became a Wesleyan evangelist, also gaining renown as a peacemaker, standing at times between armed groups, persuading them against violence in explicitly Christian terms. European missionaries recorded some of these efforts. Samuel Ironside reported encountering Christian Māori who had travelled to Taranaki from the Waikato, determined to accompany their heathen neighbours and thus, as far as possible, restrain them from violence. In 1842, Charles Creed reported meeting Māori in Taranaki and Waikato who claimed to have turned from warfare to peace and reconciliation on account of their Christianity. And we know that some who did employed their disused musket barrels to strike bells as they ushered in the Sabbath. As late as 1850, Rifa Ti Tokowaru was also preaching Christian peace. Give over war, he said. Do not say I am laying down the law. It is Christ who is doing so. Now, Ti Tokowaru's story had various phases, but his serious engagement with the ethics of peace tied to serious engagement with the Bible was a critical dimension, as it was for others. Whiteley argued that the Bible provided Māori with a symbol, argument and motive for peace, not only within Māori society but in contestation with European settlers. This was true of Nera, who juxtaposed what he described as his people's previous delight in violence with their contemporary devotion to the New Testament, to agriculture, to settled living. For Rawiri Kingi, another Wesleyan convert, the New Testament had become his weapon. There's a famous report of Kingi's comments coming as he remonstrated with settlers at Wairo, shaming them over their willing recourse to violence. You sent us this book, and it tells us not to fight, he said. You have got other weapons, weapons of blood. Use them not. Fight not, or my heathen relatives will fight too. Remember your book. Remember your book. Kingi's subversive critique came as tensions over land erupted at Wairo and the first serious violence between settlers and Māori following the signing of the treaty. Now, in this period, as John's indicated, Wesleyans sided strongly with Māori interests on these sorts of issues. As a matter of policy, the WMS had forbidden its missionaries to own land, believing that land ownership would only bring conflict and erode trust. WMS missionaries were also vigorous defenders of Māori land rights in the early 1840s. Earl Grey's famous dispatch to Governor George Grey sought to introduce a wastelands doctrine, that policy would have characterised as wasteland any land not registered as native lands by the government-appointed officers, making it all the property of the Crown. So senior Wesleyans joined CMS and evangelical humanitarians in rejecting that proposal. Walter Lowry roundly condemned it as a direct violation of the Treaty of Waitangi, quote, claiming that there is, still quoting, not an inch of the island unclaimed by a native owner, and warning of the consequences of failing to respect that. In his retrospective work, 40 Years in New Zealand, James Buller dubbed Gray's dispatch the obnoxious instruction and heaped effusive praise on Wesleyans for opposing it. In relatively quick order, however, such subversive critique of empire essentially collapsed, and the WMS missionaries emerged as champions of imperial peace. Nowhere else was that more evident than in the West Coast missions. By the mid-1850s, missionaries were increasingly aligned with state interests and power, supporting colonial moves to suppress dissent and override Māori efforts to retain lands. So the emergence of so-called land leagues in Taranaki from the early 1850s were important. Jeff Sisson's brilliant recent book, The Forgotten Prophet, describes how Māori returning to Taranaki after the Muscat Wars saw themselves as inhabiting a spiritually dangerous landscape, one stained with blood and more recently slashed by survey lines. By the 1850s, their communities were also racked by epidemics. George Stannard, the Wesleyan missionary at Waitotara, noticed that at the same time, anxiety about the disposal of land was becoming somewhat acute. This was the context in which Tā Maiti Te Ito and the Kaingarara movement began to desecrate tapu, imagining their actions as complementing the work of the missionaries, bringing the land under the authority and protection of the Christian God. Missionaries opposed them, however, not recognising the validity of their whakanoa rights, nor appreciating the concomitant unease and contestation concerning land. So when the so-called Pukitapu dispute erupted in August 1854, following the killing of Rawiri Waioa as a consequence of a contested land transaction, Wesleyan missionaries attempted to mediate. But the tone of their activities had shifted. This shift was evident, for example, in a minute of the Auckland District meeting adopted by the Australasian Wesleyan Conference, which commended the Reverend Henry Turton's efforts to maintain peace until the government could send troops to defend the New Plymouth settlement. In 1856, in the same context, Governor Thomas Gore Brown proposed to introduce a Native Offenders Bill that would grant the governor sweeping powers to ban any communication or trade with Māori within a specified district or with a particular tribe, the goal being to ensure compliance with law, colonial law. That bill was rejected by the legislature, but it received notable support from some local missionaries. Commissioner Donald McLean, who wanted to apply the bill to what he called a narrow part of Taranaki, claimed that Whiteley and Thomas Buddle were among those who strongly favoured such a measure. By 1857, WMS missionaries had become convinced that Māori should be individualising their title and perhaps even parting with their lands. In June, Whiteley was reported in the Wesleyan Missionary News, venturing that it would be the wisest policy on the part of the Aborigines if they would at once sell to the government every acre they possess in common as tribes. 2 months later, he expressed his fuller views in private correspondence with C.W. Richmond. His analysis was blunt, though confidential, since he feared it would not do for the natives to know all my thoughts. I think, he said, it would greatly benefit the natives if they would sell every acre they possess and then each one for himself repurchase and hold by Crown grant so much only as they individually require. I think it should be the primary object of the general government to extinguish the native title as soon as practicable. Despite the contested context nature of land claims, Whiteley recommended accepting all offers to sell, leaving any disputes to work themselves out over time. Furthermore, he argued, I would have the natives paid as low a price as possible for these claims, the lower the better for themselves. But even if high prices had to be given, the money would soon return into the hands of the Europeans, and thus the colony would be benefited. Soon after, Buddle argued that the possession of large tracts of land had not been good for Māori. He ridiculed the notion that extensive tracts of country be left to remain waste in their hands. Does Providence intend these vast tracts of country to remain a wilderness? Or are these parts of the earth, like other parts, to be subdued and made to yield food for man and beast? The wasteland concept was back, and now evidently firmly in favour. Before long, Waikato Māori were also being chided for their steady but absurd resistance of all fair proposals to relieve them of so great an evil as the large, but to them useless, tracts of land to which they lay claim. The emergence of kingitanga as a formal movement in the late 1850s was also viewed with suspicion. Despite kingitanga's strong Christian connections, WMS missionaries became increasingly opposed to it as an expression of disloyalty, both to the British Crown and to the missions. Buddle became convinced that the movement challenged British sovereignty and law and that this threatened Māori progress and civilisation. WMS cooperation with the state grew because of his knowledge of Māori, Aotearoa. Whiteley's services as a translator and advisor were increasingly sought by government officials. He acted as an unsalaried commissioner for native lands from 1858. And when war erupts in March 1860, Whiteley acts as a translator and go-between for the Crown, explicitly urging Wiremu Kingi Te Rangitake to surrender, rationalising his advice on the Romans 13 principle of submission to governing authorities. Throughout the war, he urged Māori opponents to give up fighting the government, submit to the authorities and withdraw their opposition to land sales. In response, the government loved them. To the extent then that there remained a vision for social peace, the primary vehicle for this was now through British law and through submission to colonial power. War might be regrettable, but it was necessary in the absence of submission to imperial peace. Now, this apparent shift in outlook described above seems strange, especially that it wasn't entirely shared by Anglican colleagues. Numerous church party leaders, as we've heard, maintained a critical but sympathetic attitude to the kingitanga, for example, for much longer. And when war erupted in Taranaki, this group opposed the government's aggression as unjust and immoral. Anglicans were left fuming at their Wesleyan counterparts. Mary Ann Martin famously accused them of toadying to a man to the government. Now, it's exceedingly doubtful that Wesleyans would have found such opprobrium by Anglicans compelling. Since the arrival of Selwyn as Bishop of New Zealand, there had been greater tensions between them. Selwyn's apparent superiority and exclusivism in refusing to recognise Wesleyan converts' baptism was a particular source of grievance. And tensions may also have been exacerbated in a period of growing settlement as settler churches expanded, encroaching on some of the comity arrangements that had existed. There's also clear evidence that Whiteley was unhappy about some Wesleyan converts switching over to the Anglican fold. But I think it's possible to explain the Wesleyan perspective of the 50s and 60s without imputing malicious intent. On the one hand, in terms of the land issue, there was a straightforward belief that individualisation of title was desirable and ultimately beneficial for Māori. Whiteley saw division and conflict over land in Taranaki and hoped that individualisation of title might resolve it. He believed it would secure peace. He may also have hoped that ministry to Māori would be made a little bit simpler, partly influenced by a quirk of the Wesleyan system. Unlike the CMS missionaries, most Wesleyans were required to minister or attempt to minister to Māori and settler communities alike. So closer contact with WS missionaries and settlers obviously nurtured much greater exposure and sympathy to their interests and demands, and that must have influenced perspectives. As numbers burgeoned, the demands for ministry to settlers also became more consuming. So again, Anaru Eketone has recently noted a family perspective that despite his decades as a missionary to Ngāti Maniapoto and Waikato tribes and having many Māori parishioners in Taranaki, Whiteley spent most of his time with the new settlers who had moved to Taranaki in search of land. And new institutions like the Australasian Wesleyan Methodist Connection, which included 2 New Zealand districts, sharpened ideas about an intimate connection between colonial progress and prosperity and the spread of scriptural Christianity. That was a quote. One other important factor relates to the political conservatism that numerous commentators note emerged in the 1790s and 1800s among British Wesleyans. Growing conservatism has been interpreted as a response to pressure on the one hand from the British government, notably in the famous Sidmouth Bills of 1811, which proposed to try and contain threats posed by religious dissent, and on the other hand, those posed by political radicals. As a consequence, numerous scholars have argued that Wesleyan loyalty to the Crown became a point of acute sensitivity. Wesleyans responded by becoming hyper-loyal to the Crown. They appear to have, and that hyper-loyalty appears to have been transported to New Zealand with some vigour. Now that last point is actually quite important for the argument that I want to make here by way of conclusion, just in case a sign needs to be raised. Part of what I want to argue here is that the apparent turn in Wesleyan viewpoint was not entirely inconsistent or entirely unforeseeable. In important respects, it was consistent with deep-seated outlooks as well as political theologies that cultivated loyalty to the state. It was also facilitated by the structure of WMS ministry, so how the church organised itself had a role to play. But relatedly, their apparent shift was not exactly a complete betrayal of a commitment to peace either, at least not in their understanding. Rather, it makes more sense to see it within a tradition of Christian peace and a commitment to a gospel of peace. This was, however, peace of a very particular type. Now, I've got to confess, I really don't like typologies and I don't use them very often. They do tend to flatten out depth and they can do violence to human complexity and kind of narrative. But my argument in employing a typology here of proselytizing, subversive, imperial peace is not to throw shade on Christian peace or missionary peacemaking or to reduce it to mere discourse. Typologies are provocations. And in this context, the provocation concerns recognising the complexities of peace, which is almost always inevitably plural, contingent, contested. However else we think about it, the peace of missionary Christianity was not benignly apolitical. It was invariably disruptive and also deeply entangled in colonial dynamics. Kia ora.